My name is Cecile Hartman and I am 34 years old. Last April, my parents threw my younger sister a $12,000 gender reveal party. There was a live band, a catered feast, a rented waterfront venue, and nearly 90 people cheering. 5 weeks after that, I sat at my parents' kitchen table and told them I was pregnant too. My mother folded her hands on the table, looked me straight in the eye and said, "Don't go expecting what we did for Vanessa. You chose a man who will never measure up to this family." My father stared at his coffee cup. My sister pulled out her phone and started showing my mother a diaper bag she wanted. My grandmother, Ruth Hartman, who had been sitting quietly by the window, slowly placed her teacup down and looked at my mother with the kind of eyes that have seen too much to pretend they haven't. I did not cry. I did not argue. I took my husband's hand, picked up my bag from the chair, and walked out the front door. But what nobody at that table understood was that my grandmother had not simply been sitting by that window that evening. She had been watching our family for 31 years. Every birthday skipped. Every achievement passed over in silence. Every dinner where I sat invisible at my own family's table. And 8 months later, at a baby shower my work friend Priya organized from scratch because my own family never offered, my grandmother handed me a cream-colored envelope that would eventually bring my mother and father to the sidewalk outside my house, crying, asking for a second chance at something they had always assumed they were entitled to. Before I get into what that envelope held, please hit like and subscribe, but only if this story is sitting somewhere real in your chest right now. Leave me a comment and tell me where in the world you are watching from and what the clock says where you are. I personally read through every single one. Now let me take you all the way back. Back to that waterfront gender reveal. The evening where 90 people gathered to celebrate my sister while I stood near the drink table feeling 4 weeks pregnant and completely unseen. My sister Vanessa is 5 years younger than me. She is 29 and married to Clifton Marsh, the third son of the Marsh family, who built their fortune in commercial real estate development across 3 counties. When Vanessa announced her pregnancy, my mother behaved as though the town crier should be dispatched immediately. She and my father began planning the gender reveal within 48 hours of hearing the news. The venue was a rented waterfront property about 25 minutes outside of town. It had a floating dock, a wraparound upper deck, string lights stretching across the entire back lawn, and a catering setup that included carved prime rib and a raw oyster station. My father hired a photographer who had covered weddings for regional magazines. There was a live acoustic trio playing on a raised platform near the dock. The confetti cannon was operated by someone wearing a company polo shirt. I stood near the appetizer table in a navy dress that I had worn to a coworker's promotion dinner the month before. 4 weeks pregnant, a secret I was still carrying in my chest like a folded note I had not yet passed. My stomach was turning steadily from the moment I arrived. Part morning sickness, part something older and more familiar. My father stepped up to the microphone the venue had provided and cleared his throat. The crowd of 90 people turned to face him. He smiled the smile he saves for when there is an audience. He said, "Tonight is about what this family stands for. Legacy, excellence, choosing the right kind of life." He paused just long enough for it to feel rehearsed. "Vanessa, Clifton, you two have made us prouder than words can hold." The crowd applauded like they were at a theater. The confetti cannon fired and gold and pink paper burst across the water and landed on people's shoulders and in their wine glasses. My mother grabbed Vanessa with both arms and held her and swayed, and I could hear her from where I stood, saying "my sweet perfect girl" over and over while the photographer clicked away capturing every second of it. Smiled. I held my sparkling water. I clapped until the skin at the center of my palms felt warm. And then I looked to the far left of the lawn, near a round table set slightly apart from the others. My grandmother Ruth was sitting there alone, her plate untouched, her hands wrapped around a glass of iced tea. She was not watching the confetti settle on the water. She was not watching Vanessa or Clifton. She was watching me. Steady and quiet and patient, the way someone watches when they have already decided something and are simply waiting for the right moment. I looked away first. 5 weeks later, Sunday dinner at my parents' house in the east side of town. The kind of neighborhood where the hedges get trimmed on a schedule and everyone has an opinion about porch paint colors. My husband Desmond drove. I had the ultrasound in the inside pocket of my cardigan. He parked at the curb and before we got out he rested his hand on mine and said, "Whatever they say tonight, you remember who you are." The house smelled like rosemary chicken and whatever candle my mother orders from a catalog every October. Vanessa was already at the table with Clifton beside her, flipping through something on a tablet. My father was in the kitchen pouring water into glasses the way he always does at dinner, slow and deliberate as if the task required real concentration. My grandmother was at her usual chair at the far end of the table. She looked up when Desmond and I came in and her eyes softened just slightly. I waited until the food had been passed and the first few minutes of small talk about Clifton's latest project had finished. Then I reached into my cardigan, pulled out the ultrasound photo and slid it across the white tablecloth to my mother. I said, "We have some news. There is a baby coming in February." My mother picked up the photo. She held it between two fingers and angled it toward the light above the table. The room sat absolutely still for a moment. And then she placed it face down on the tablecloth beside her fork and said, "Well, don't go expecting what we did for Vanessa. You chose a man who will never measure up to this family." My father picked up his fork and cut into his chicken. He did not look at me. Vanessa glanced briefly at the photo on the table and then said, "Oh, that's nice. Cecile, did I show you the nursery theme I picked? It is a whole vintage woodland concept. I found these mushroom-shaped wall sconces under the dinner table." Desmond pressed his hand against mine and held it firmly. I could feel how carefully still he was holding himself. Desmond is not the kind of man who rattles easily. He runs his own landscaping and grounds design company. He works outdoors in every season. His hands are thick and calloused and steady from years of physical work. But sitting at that table in my parents' house, his hand against mine was trembling in a way I had never felt from him before. At her end of the table my grandmother picked up her teacup and set it back down without drinking from it. She looked at my mother for a long and measured moment. She said nothing. She simply looked, the way you look at someone when you have finally stopped holding your breath waiting for them to do better. No one else at the table noticed. Desmond and I sat in the car outside my parents' house for almost half an hour after dinner. We did not start the engine. He held both of my hands in his lap and kept his eyes straight ahead. I cried, the kind of crying that is barely audible, the kind that happens in the back of your throat when you have been holding your face steady for 2.5 hours and finally you don't have to anymore. It was not the first time I had sat in that driveway crying. What people on the outside of a family like mine never quite understand is that it was never one moment. It was never a single terrible evening. It was a pattern so deeply worn into the floorboards of my childhood that it had its own texture underfoot. When I was 15, I won the regional writing prize at school. Came with a certificate and a small scholarship deposit. My parents did not attend the assembly. That same month, Vanessa, who was 10 at the time, performed in a community theater production 3 towns over. My parents took the whole family. They brought flowers. They bought dinner afterward at the best restaurant in that town. I heard about it when I got home and saw the photos on the camera sitting on the kitchen counter. When I graduated university on a full academic scholarship with no debt to anyone, my parents arrived late, sat in the back, and left before the reception because Vanessa had a dance showcase that afternoon. My wedding had 28 guests. My parents gave us $1,200 toward it, and my mother spent the following month telling anyone who would listen that the centerpieces looked like something from a school fundraiser. Vanessa's wedding, held 6 months before mine, had 220 guests, a full catered reception, a string quartet, and a custom floral installation my mother designed herself and has photographed on her bedroom wall to this day. Desmond wiped the side of my face with the edge of his sleeve. He said, "Cecile, you don't need to justify choosing me to anyone. Not to them. Not to anyone." He was right. Desmond built his landscaping business from nothing more than a second-hand truck, a set of tools, and a reputation for doing exactly what he said he would do. His company now handles commercial contracts across 4 districts. He earns well into the 6 figures annually, and recently completed a full grounds design project for a resort that was featured in a regional tourism publication. He is not beneath anyone on this earth. But my mother measured a man's worth by the name on his family's gate and the zip code he grew up in. And Desmond grew up on the north side of town in a neighborhood where nobody had a gate. What I did not yet know as I sat in that car was that someone had been keeping a detailed, private, and very precise record of every one of these moments going back 3 decades. 2 weeks after that Sunday dinner, I called my grandmother the way I had done every week for the past 7 years. She lived alone in the house my grandfather had built and did not own a smartphone and referred to social media as a machine designed to make people feel important for the wrong reasons. I asked her how her tomato plants were doing. She asked whether I had been managing the nausea. And then her voice changed its register slightly. She said, "Your mother phoned me on Thursday. She told me I should not be making the drive out to see you as much as I have been. Said the roads are not safe for a woman my age and that I should be thinking about my health more seriously." I gripped the edge of the kitchen counter. "She told you to stop coming to see me. She said she was concerned about my safety." Same message, neater envelope. My chest went tight and then tight again. My grandmother had made the trip out to see Desmond and me nearly every single month for 7 years. 2 hours each way, sometimes more in winter traffic. She brought food. She brought seeds from her garden. She stayed for the weekend twice a year. Not once in 7 years had my mother offered to drive her, organize the trip, or contribute to it in any way. And now suddenly the road was dangerous. "Grandmother, are you going to stop coming?" A pause that lasted exactly the right amount of time. And then she said, "I am 79 years old, Cecile. I have been driving that road since before your mother knew how to spell her own name. I will decide what is safe for me." I let out a breath I had not realized I was holding. But the following week I received a call from my cousin Adele, who told me that my mother had been telling the wider family a different version of events. According to what Adele heard, I was the one who had distanced myself from the family. I was the one who never made effort. I was the one who had turned cold since marrying Desmond, and it was sad really because my mother had tried so hard to maintain a relationship with me, but I simply didn't seem to want one. I sat on the floor of my hallway after that phone call. The lights were off. Desmond was in the garage finishing a client proposal. Did not call him in. I just sat there on the cold tile and thought about all the years I had spent trying to be seen at that table, and all the years I had been handed a story about myself that had nothing to do with who I actually was. The pattern wasn't new. It was just finally visible from a different angle. The week after Adele's call, I drove to my parents' house to pick up a box of my old books that my mother had mentioned she was clearing out. I arrived in the late morning. Desmond had offered to come, but I told him I needed to do this one on my own. My mother was in the sitting room when I arrived. She was on the phone. She waved me toward the back hallway without covering the receiver. I found the box in the spare room where it had been sitting since I moved out at 22. On top of the books there was an old photograph I did not recognize at first. It was my grandmother and my grandfather standing in front of a piece of land. Trees behind them, a hand-painted sign at the edge of the frame. My grandfather was pointing at something off camera, and my grandmother was laughing with her head tipped back. I took the photo out and held it for a while. Then I put it back in the box and took the whole thing to the car. On the way out, my mother was off the phone. She was standing in the kitchen doorway. She said, "I hope you're not expecting an invitation to Vanessa's maternity photo shoot. The photographer only works with small groups and Clifton's family is already coming." I said, "I didn't know there was one." She said, "Well, you know now." I drove. I did not call Desmond until I had sat in the parking garage of our building for 10 minutes first. When I told him what she had said, he was quiet for a moment and then he said, "You know what I think?" I said, "What?" He said, "I think the day is coming when what they think about us stops mattering at all." He was right. I just didn't know how close that day was. Vanessa's maternity photo shoot was held on a Thursday 3 weeks later at a botanical garden about 40 minutes from town. I know this because my cousin Adele sent me one of the photos without realizing I hadn't been invited. It was a beautiful picture. Vanessa in a blush dress surrounded by flowering hedges, Clifton behind her, my parents flanking them on either side, my mother's hand on Vanessa's shoulder and her face turned slightly toward the camera with the expression she reserves for moments she intends to remember. I looked at the photo for about 30 seconds. Then I put my phone face down on the dining room table and went to finish the dinner I had been making. I did not cry that night. I think I had started to move into a different stage of it. Less grief, more clarity. The recognition that what I had been grieving was not the loss of something. It was the final acknowledgement of something that had never actually been there. The following Sunday, I drove to my grandmother's house. I had not told my mother I was going. I brought a container of the lentil soup my grandmother had taught me to make years earlier, and a small cactus from the plant shop near our building because she had mentioned once that she liked plants that survived with very little fuss. She opened the door before I even knocked. She had been in the garden. Her hands still had soil on them, and she was wearing the green apron my grandfather had bought her from a hardware store 30 years ago. She looked at the soup, looked at the cactus and said, "Come in before the neighbor's cat follows you." We ate at the small round table in her kitchen. The radio was on low. She asked about Desmond's latest project and I told her about the resort contract. She nodded with genuine approval and said, "A man who works with his hands and his head both is not common. Don't forget that." I asked her how she had been since my mother's phone call about the driving. He set her spoon down and looked at me with the expression I had known since childhood. Steady, unhurried, completely without performance. She said, "Your mother has been running a particular story about this family for a long time. She believes it so completely that she has forgotten it is a story." I asked her what she meant. She did not answer immediately. She picked up her spoon again and finished a few more mouthfuls. Then she said, "Your grandfather left a few things in order before he went. I have been thinking about those things quite a lot recently." I did not push. With my grandmother, pushing was never the way. She told you what she wanted to tell you when the ground was right for it and not a moment before. I drove home that evening in the kind of quiet that feels purposeful rather than empty. Something had shifted in the air between us without either of us naming it directly. 3 weeks later, Desmond and I attended the gender reveal for Vanessa and Clifton. Yes, we were invited. A digital invitation sent to a group thread that also included Clifton's 4 siblings and their partners. The reveal was at my parents' house this time, a smaller gathering than the first event, about 30 people in the backyard. My mother had rented a cotton candy machine and strung new lights along the fence. There was a dessert table with a tiered cake covered in white fondant. I wore a yellow dress that Desmond said made me look like early morning sunlight. He said it without irony and meant every word. When the cake was cut and the inside revealed blue layers, my father lifted his fist in the air and shouted, and my mother burst into tears of joy and reached for Vanessa, and everyone in the yard clapped and took photos on their phones. Clapped too. I genuinely did. I wanted my sister to have joy. I had never wanted anything less for her. What I wanted was simply to also exist. My grandmother stood near the back door to the kitchen. She was holding a glass of lemonade and watching me with that same steady gaze from the waterfront party. I gave her a small nod. She gave me one back. The following month I entered my 3rd trimester and the world of late pregnancy logistics fully took over my calendar. Midwife appointments, birth plan conversations. Sorting through the room we were converting into the nursery. Desmond built the crib himself from white oak. Took him 3 weekends and he sanded it so smooth you could press your cheek against it and feel nothing but warmth. I sat in the doorway of that half-finished room more evenings than I can count just watching him measure and cut and fit pieces together. There is something about watching someone make something beautiful with their hands for someone they love that settles every argument without a word. My mother called once during those weeks to ask about my due date. The conversation lasted under 4 minutes and ended with her saying that she hoped I had a good support system because birth was not easy and it was important to have the right people around me. I said, "I do." She said, "Good." That was all. Desmond's mother, Elaine, called 3 times a week without fail. She had already knitted 2 blankets, a hat, and a pair of booties. She mailed them with a card that said she could not wait to meet the newest person in the family, and that she was praying for an easy delivery, and for all of us to sleep in the first 3 months, which she acknowledged was probably too much to ask. I kept the card on the windowsill of the nursery. Priya, my work friend who was already organizing the baby shower, called every few days with logistical questions delivered in the tone of someone running a small military operation. She asked whether I preferred morning or afternoon, whether I wanted a wishing well, and whether any of the guests had nut allergies she should know about. I told her I was grateful for her, and she said, "Stop that. Just tell me about the nut allergies." My grandmother called every Sunday. She asked practical questions about how I was sleeping, whether I was eating enough iron, and whether Desmond had finished the crib yet. When I told her he had, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Your grandfather would have liked that man." I had to set the phone down for a second to collect myself before I could respond. My cousin Adele texted me in the middle of a Tuesday to ask how I was feeling. She said she had been thinking about me more than usual, and that she was sorry she hadn't always said the right things and that she was working on it. I wrote back, "You're already doing it." And she sent back 3 heart emojis, which from Adele is essentially a declaration of personal transformation. During those weeks something else was also happening quietly, something I would not fully understand until much later. My grandmother had started spending more time at her desk. Her neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Okafor, mentioned it to me when I called to check in one afternoon after my grandmother had not answered her phone. Mrs. Okafor said, "Ruth has been at her writing desk a great deal lately. I see the lamp on late into the evening. I thought you should know she seems quite purposeful about whatever she's doing." I thanked her and said I would stop by that weekend. When I arrived Saturday morning, my grandmother was in the garden pulling up the last of the summer squash. The desk lamp was off. Looked up when I came through the gate and said, "I wondered when you'd show up. There's coffee." We spent the morning in the garden and then moved to the kitchen and talked about small things, the tomatoes, a documentary she had watched, the new library branch that had opened near her street. At no point did she mention the writing desk. And I had learned enough by then to understand that some things were not for asking about. They were for waiting. By the time my 8th month arrived, I had found a rhythm that felt genuinely sustainable. Desmond and I had our routines. Sunday mornings with coffee on the back porch. Wednesday evenings where he worked in the garage and I read in the armchair by the front window with my feet up on the ottoman. He had built me specifically for the 3rd trimester. Weekly calls with his mother Elaine. Monthly visits from my grandmother. Priya arriving unannounced every 10 days or so with food and strong opinions about everything. The anxiety that had lived in my chest since the night I slid that ultrasound photo across my parents' dinner table had not vanished entirely, but it had changed its nature. It was less like dread and more like awareness. I knew what the situation was. I had stopped waiting for it to be something different. One evening in my 34th week, I got a call from my cousin Adele. Her voice was careful in the way it gets when she is about to say something difficult. She told me that at a family dinner at my parents' house that past weekend, my mother had announced that she was planning to throw herself a dinner party in 2 months' time, and that she fully expected to host the baby's first public outing there. My mother had apparently told the table that it would be a good opportunity for the family to welcome the new arrival properly, and that she was already thinking about the menu. Adele said, "I don't think she has talked to you about it." I said, "No, she hasn't." There was a pause. Adele said, "I thought you should know." I thanked her and said I appreciated it. After I hung up, I sat with the information for about an hour. Then I wrote my mother a text message. I said that I had heard she was planning an event around the baby's arrival, and that I wanted to be clear that any plans involving my child would need to involve my consent first and would happen on a timeline that Desmond and I decided together. My mother replied the next morning. She said she had only been trying to do something nice for the family, and that she was surprised I would respond that way when she was simply trying to make an effort. I replied with 2 sentences. I said I was glad she wanted to make an effort. I said the way to do that was to ask rather than announce. She did not reply after that. Desmond read the exchange when I showed him and said, "That was exactly right." He poured me a glass of orange juice and went back to the client call he had paused to read it. The baby shower Priya organized was held on a Saturday morning in late November at the event space above the bookshop on our street. It was smaller than anything my parents had ever thrown for. Vanessa, 22 people. String lights, mismatched teacups that Priya had collected from thrift stores over the course of 2 months because she had decided the aesthetic was cozy and intentional, and she was correct. There were flowers from Desmond's mother in a mason jar on the welcome table. There was a card station where guests could write notes to the baby to be opened on their 18th birthday. There was excellent food that Priya had sourced from 4 different places, a decision she described as logistically complicated and personally worth every second of effort. Desmond's sister came in from out of town and brought a gift wrapped in brown paper with a hand-drawn map on it that pointed to a constellation she had named after the baby before the baby had a name. 3 of my work colleagues came. Mrs. Okafor, my grandmother's neighbor, sent a card because she could not make the drive but wanted to be represented. Adele came. She arrived early, helped Priya move tables, and did not once check her phone. And my grandmother arrived at 11:45 in the morning wearing her good cardigan, the navy one with the small pearl buttons, carrying a covered dish of the lemon cake she had been making for every family birthday since before I was born. She walked straight to me, took both my hands in hers, looked me over once from head to foot the way she had done since I was small and said, "You look like a woman who has found her ground." I said, "I think I have." She nodded once with great satisfaction and went to find somewhere to sit. The shower lasted 3 hours. Toward the end, when most of the guests had gathered near the card station, my grandmother found me by the window. She pressed a cream-colored envelope into both of my hands. It was sealed and slightly heavy. She said, "Not today. When the baby is here and the dust has settled." I looked at her. I said, "Grandma." She said, "I have known for a long time what I wanted to do. I just needed to wait until you had built something worth protecting." I held the envelope against my chest for the rest of the afternoon. I did not open it. I put it in the inside pocket of the bag I had brought to the shower, and I carried it home and placed it on top of the dresser in our bedroom where I could see it from the bed. That evening Desmond asked about it. I told him what she had said. He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "Whatever it is, it comes from the right place." I said, "Everything she does comes from the right place." He nodded and turned off the lamp. We lay in the dark with the envelope sitting on the dresser and the baby moving quietly in my belly, and the porch light from the house across the street making a thin bar of gold across the ceiling. I did not sleep for a while, but it was not the anxious kind of wakefulness. It was the other kind, where you lie still because the moment feels like something you want to be present for. My grandmother's house was 2 hours away, and she had been driving it alone for 7 years, and my mother had tried to take that from her too. And still she had sat in that corner of every room, watching and waiting and keeping a record, and writing things down at her desk with a lamp on late into the evening. Thought about all of it for a long time before I finally fell asleep. Desmond was up before me. He brought coffee to the bedside table and sat at the foot of the bed with his own mug and said nothing, which was the exact right thing to do. I did not open the envelope that morning. I put it back in the bag. There was still time. The baby was not here yet. My grandmother had said when the baby is here. I was going to honor that. In early December I went to visit my parents' house for the first time since the Sunday dinner where I had slid the ultrasound photo across the table. Desmond came with me. I had called ahead and confirmed both the time and the nature of the visit. I was not there for a social call. I was there to be clear about something. I sat at the same kitchen table. My father was present. My mother sat across from me. I told them that I had thought carefully about the kind of relationship I wanted my child to have with their grandparents and that I wanted one for them too. I told them that I was not coming to them with grievances or to relitigate the past. I was coming with terms. My mother started to say something and I held up one hand gently and said I would like to finish. She closed her mouth. I said there were 3 things I needed from them. The first was that Desmond was to be treated in this family with full and visible respect. Not tolerance. Respect. The second was that any events, plans, or gatherings involving my child would be arranged with my consent and my scheduling in advance. Always. The third was that I was not available for narratives. If I heard that a version of my family story was being circulated that I did not recognize as true, the access to my child would be paused while we addressed it directly. I slid a single folded piece of paper across the table. I said, "These are written down. Have a copy. This is yours." My mother looked at the paper. My father looked at my mother. The room was very quiet. Then my father said, "Cecile, we hear you." My mother said nothing for a long moment. And then she picked up the piece of paper and folded it once and placed it on the table in front of her. She said, "I don't want to lose you." I said, "Then don't." Desmond put his hand on my knee under the table. I left that house 30 minutes later, feeling nothing dramatic. Not triumphant. Not relieved exactly. More like someone who had finally stopped waiting for a different weather system and had simply put on the right coat for the one that existed. December moved quickly. Desmond finished a large commercial project and came home on a Friday afternoon with a quiet satisfaction in his face that he reserved for work done completely well. I put the final things in the nursery. The white oak crib. The quilt Elaine had mailed in a box wrapped in so much brown paper that Desmond spent 4 minutes opening it and then laughed for 2 more. The framed watercolor print Priya had found at a street market, soft green leaves on a cream background, which she had insisted was the perfect thing for that particular wall and was absolutely right. My grandmother called the week before Christmas. She asked if I had eaten anything interesting recently. She asked whether the crib had held up to Desmond's inspection, meaning his own standards, which she knew were high. She asked how the conversations with my parents had been going. I told her what I had said at the kitchen table and she was quiet for a moment and then she said, "Good. That is exactly right." I asked her how she was. She said she was very well and that she had finished something she had been working on for some time and that it felt right to have it done. I did not ask what it was. I told her I loved her and she said she knew that and she loved me back and that she would talk to me Sunday. I put the phone down and looked at the envelope on the dresser for a long time. My mother called on Christmas Eve. She asked what Desmond and I were doing for the day. I said we were having a quiet one at home. She said she wished we were coming for dinner. I said we had made our plans. She said she understood. There was a pause. She said, "Your sister's little boy is going to be here." I said, "I know. Give them all my love." Another pause. She said, "We want to be there when the baby comes, Cecile." I said, "We'll let you know." That was all. It was the most honest phone call we had exchanged in possibly years, and neither of us acknowledged that fact out loud. Desmond and I spent Christmas Eve making dinner together in our kitchen with the radio on and his mother on a video call. Propped up against the fruit bowl while she talked us through the recipe for the sweet potato dish she had been promising to teach us for 3 years. Elaine's voice filled our kitchen for 2 hours, and she made us laugh 4 separate times, which, given that I was 37 weeks pregnant and had not slept more than 5 hours in a row since October, was an actual achievement. I went to bed that night feeling the particular exhaustion of someone very close to the end of a long waiting period. Not just pregnancy. All of it. The envelope was still on the dresser. The baby was nearly here. Just a few more days. I woke on December 27th at 4 in the morning to the clear and unmistakable sensation that the waiting was over. I sat up and said Desmond's name once. Quietly, and he was awake immediately. He sat up, looked at me, took my hand and said, "Okay. Let's go." He had the bag already packed and by the door. He had had it there for 3 weeks. He had checked it twice. On the way to the hospital I looked at the city going past in the dark. The lights on in the buildings, the streets empty and clean, the sky that particular shade that happens in the hour before dawn that has no real name. I thought about my grandmother at her writing desk with the lamp on. I thought about the envelope on the dresser. I thought about Desmond saying some men fill a room by talking, and I thought about the fact that I had somehow ended up with the other kind. Our daughter was born on December 27th at 7:14 in the morning. £6 15 ounces. Dark eyes. That tracked the room from the first hour. A grip on Desmond's finger so determined that the nurse laughed and said she had plans. Desmond sat in the chair beside the bed and held her for a long time without saying anything, and then he looked up at me, and his face was entirely open in the way faces only get when something happens that is larger than any frame you thought to build for it. Priya arrived at the hospital at 9 with coffee for Desmond, and a stuffed elephant she had been keeping in the trunk of her car for a month. She stayed for 40 minutes, said everything she needed to say with complete efficiency, and left so we could sleep. Desmond's mother called at 10 and stayed on the phone for an hour, even though she cried for most of the first 20 minutes, and we did not say anything important for any of it, and it was one of the better conversations I have had. My grandmother came the following day. Adele drove the full 2 hours each way to bring her and stayed in the waiting room the entire time without complaint or announcement, which Adele told me later was the best thing she had done in recent memory, and I believe her. When Ruth Hartman walked into that hospital room and I put my daughter into her arms, the room did something that rooms occasionally do in moments that were always going to happen. It settled. My grandmother looked at the baby for a long time. Then she began humming something low and soft and unhurried. A melody I had never heard before. I asked about it later, and she said it was a song her own grandmother had hummed while doing the dishes. Something that had lived in the women of the family for 4 generations without ever being written down. 4 generations in a melody. That evening I sent my mother a photograph. Our daughter wrapped in the cream-colored blanket Elaine had knitted. Her face turned slightly toward the light. Typed 3 words. She is here. My mother replied 90 minutes later. She is beautiful. Can we come? I replied Sunday at 2. Desmond will be home. Short, clear, and entirely on our terms. They came that Sunday at exactly 2 o'clock. My father held our daughter in the armchair in the living room, and his hands moved carefully and his jaw was pulled tight the way it goes when a man is holding something very fragile and is trying not to show how frightened he is of getting it wrong. My mother walked into the nursery and stood at the crib for a long moment. She ran her hand along the smooth top rail and then she turned to Desmond and said quietly, "You made this?" He said, "Yes." She said, "It's extraordinary." He said, "Thank you." Small thing. Said plainly, but real. 3 days after they visited, I finally opened the envelope. Desmond was at a client meeting. Our daughter was asleep in the crib. The house was quiet the way it only gets on a weekday morning when the whole neighborhood has gone somewhere. I sat at the kitchen table. I picked up the envelope and held it for a moment, and then I opened it carefully along the top edge. Inside was a letter written by hand on my grandmother's cream stationery in the ink she had used since before I was born, blue, slightly thick, the handwriting that slopes gently to the right the way it always has. And behind the letter, there were 3 additional pages. Deed, property title, and a letter from her attorney. My grandmother owned a cottage on a lake 2 hours north of town. She had owned it since 1978. My grandfather had bought it the year they married with money he had saved for 5 years working double shifts. They had spent every summer of their married life there. When my grandfather died, she had kept paying the taxes, kept the maintenance up, kept it in the family trust. My parents had always assumed that when the time came, it would fold into the larger estate and be handled accordingly, meaning they had assumed without asking and without being told that they had some claim to it. The letter explained that my grandmother had made a decision 18 months earlier, before the gender reveal, before the Sunday dinner, before any of this specific season of events, though she had been watching the pattern for 30 years and the decision had simply been waiting for the right moment to be made official. She had transferred the cottage directly to me. The property title was already in my name. Her attorney had filed it 6 weeks prior. It was done. It was mine. I read the letter 3 times. Then I sat with the deed in my hands and looked at the window and listened to our daughter breathing through the baby monitor on the counter. My grandmother had written in the letter, "I have watched you show up your entire life without being invited to the front of the room. I have watched you choose decency over drama and love over leverage. I watched them dismiss the man you built a life with because he did not have the right last name, and I watched you hold your head steady through all of it. This cottage was built on the same values. Your grandfather worked for it quietly, without asking for recognition, and he was content because the work itself was honest. I wanted to go somewhere those values will be honored. Belongs with you. She had also written, I am asking you to make me one promise. Tell no one until you are ready. Let the dust settle. Let the moment find its own time. Folded the letter along its original crease and placed it back in the envelope. Then I called my grandmother. She picked up on the second ring. I said, Grandma. She said, I know. I said, I don't have the right words. She said, you don't need them. How is she sleeping? I said, badly but beautifully. She laughed, and it was the laugh I had known my whole life, low and warm and entirely her own. I sat at that kitchen table for a while after we hung up, the baby monitor still carrying the soft sound of our daughter breathing. The deed on the table in front of me. Outside, a car passed slowly on the street. The ordinary world going on in its ordinary way. What my parents did not know yet. What Vanessa did not know yet. What the wider family did not know yet was that the thing they had always quietly assumed was somewhere in their future had already, quietly, completely, and legally become mine. Kept the promise. Told no one. Not even Desmond, not for the first 2 days. On the third day, I sat him down at the kitchen table in the evening after dinner and put the envelope in front of him. He read the letter first. Then the deed. Then the attorney's pages. He read everything twice, the way he reads anything important, carefully and without rushing. When he finished, he placed everything back in the envelope and set it on the table between us and said, Your grandmother is extraordinary. I said, I know. He said, What do you want to do with it? I said, I want to go see it. He said, Then we'll go. January passed. February arrived. Our daughter was growing and changing in the way that new babies do, at a pace that feels simultaneously too fast and exactly right. Priya came over every 10 days or so and sat on the living room floor with the baby on a blanket and held court on a variety of subjects while Desmond and I ate food she had brought with 2 free hands. Adele texted regularly. Desmond's mother called her usual 3 times a week and had already put in a request to visit for a full 2 weeks in the spring, which we immediately approved. My parents came twice more in January on the scheduled Sunday visits. My mother held the baby with more ease the second time. She commented on the mobile Desmond had made and hung above the crib. Small wooden shapes, cloud and moon and simple bird, each one sanded smooth and painted soft colors. She said, Desmond, this is really something. He said, she seems to like the bird best. My mother looked at the bird for a moment and said, Yes, I can see why. It was a small thing. But small things were what we had to work with, and I had decided that I was going to accept them as what they were rather than measure them against what they were not. My sister Vanessa texted me in the middle of January on a Tuesday afternoon. The message said, Hey, I've been thinking. Can we talk sometime? Not a big thing. Just talk. Said yes. Name a day. She said, Thursday morning. I said Thursday at 10. She called at 10 on Thursday and we talked for 45 minutes. She asked about the baby's sleep schedule. Asked about her son. She asked how Desmond and I were doing. And then she was quiet for a moment and she said, I think I've let a lot of things go by that I should have said something about. I said, Like what? She said, Like when Mom put the ultrasound picture face down on the table. I had not expected that. I said, You remember that? She said, I remember it. I didn't say anything and I should have. I said, You didn't know what to do. She said, That's probably true. But I've been thinking about it for months. I told her I appreciated it. She said she just wanted to try to do better. It was the first time in 34 years my sister had voluntarily offered me something without it circling back to herself immediately afterward. I sat with that for a while after we hung up. It was not a transformation. It was a beginning, which is a different thing and in some ways more valuable because beginnings can actually go somewhere. In early March, 3 months after our daughter was born, Desmond and I drove north to see the cottage. We left on a Friday morning. The baby was in the back seat in her car seat, and Elaine had knitted a second hat for exactly this purpose because she had apparently known we would be making trips in cold weather and had planned accordingly. The road went through countryside I had not driven through before, old farmland and woodlands still bare from winter, occasional houses set back far from the road with smoke coming from their chimneys. The cottage sat on the eastern bank of the lake. The driveway was gravel. There were 3 birch trees in the front yard, white bark, bare branches. The cottage itself was small and wooden, and painted a deep green that had weathered over the years to something softer and more particular. There was a porch facing the water with 2 old wooden chairs that needed sanding. The lake in March was steel-colored and entirely still. Desmond unlocked the front door with a key my grandmother had sent, and we walked inside. It smelled like wood and cold air and something faint that I could not name but recognized immediately as the smell of a place that has been cared for. The furniture was old and solid and good. A round kitchen table. A stone fireplace. Built-in shelves along one wall filled with old books, some paperback, some hardcover, some with spines that had faded past reading. Desmond walked through each room slowly and quietly with his professional eyes on the structure, and his other eyes on something else entirely. I stood in the kitchen and looked out the window at the lake. Our daughter was in my arms, awake, and looking at the light on the water with the concentration she brought to everything new. I thought about my grandfather buying this place on money he had saved for 5 years working double shifts. I thought about my grandmother saying your grandfather would have liked that man. I thought about the writing desk with the lamp on late in the evening. I said out loud to no one in particular or possibly to all of it. Okay. Desmond came back through the kitchen doorway. He looked at me and then at the lake and then back at me. He said, "The bones are excellent. The porch stairs need replacing. The roof was done recently and it shows. Someone has been taking good care of this place." I said, "She has." He nodded. We stood at the kitchen window for a while with our daughter between us and the lake in front of us and the old round table behind us, and I did not say anything else because there was nothing else that needed saying. We drove back on Sunday. Before we left I walked out to the porch and stood at the rail and looked at the water for a long time. There was a bird on one of the birch trees, small and brown and entirely unimpressed by the occasion, and I found that very comforting. We had not yet told my parents about the cottage. My grandmother had asked me to wait until the dust settled and I was still honoring that. But the month of March brought its own timing in the form of my grandmother's 81st birthday, which her granddaughter Adele organized with the family's help, a gathering at a restaurant in town that Adele had booked 3 weeks in advance and coordinated with quiet, genuine care. My parents came. Vanessa and Clifton came with their son. Desmond's mother had sent flowers to the restaurant in advance. My grandmother arrived in a car Adele drove and came through the restaurant door in the good cardigan, and with the expression of someone who was content to be fussed over in reasonable measure. She was seated at the head of the table. My mother sat to her right. I sat to her left. During the dinner my mother leaned across the table at one point and asked my grandmother whether she had given any thought to putting the lake cottage on the market. She said property prices in that area had been going up and it might be a good time to consider options. My grandmother looked at her daughter-in-law for a long, even moment and said, "That decision was made some time ago." My mother said, "Oh." My grandmother said, "The cottage is Cecile's." The table was quiet. My mother looked at me. My father looked at my grandmother. My grandmother reached for her water glass with perfect serenity. My mother said, "I'm sorry." My grandmother said, "I transferred the title to Cecile last autumn. It has been legally hers since November. The paperwork was filed by my attorney and is entirely in order." My mother sat very still. Vanessa looked at Clifton. My father set down his fork. The restaurant noise continued around our table, completely indifferent to the earthquake happening at it. My mother said, "You didn't discuss this with us." My grandmother said, "No, I didn't." My mother said, "That is a significant family asset." My grandmother said, "Yes, and I chose who I wanted to have it." My mother's voice shifted upward slightly in a way I recognized. She said, We assumed that property would be, my grandmother said. You assumed. That is different from being told. My father put his hand on my mother's arm. She stopped speaking. My grandmother looked around the table once slowly and said, "This is my birthday dinner and I would like to enjoy it. We can have a different conversation at a different time if it is genuinely necessary. I expect that when we have it, everyone will remember that this was my property. I worked for it alongside my husband, and I was entitled to do with it exactly what I did." And then she turned to Adele and asked about the dessert situation. Nobody spoke about the cottage again that evening. Dessert was brought. Candles were lit. My grandmother blew them out with one breath and looked quietly satisfied. After dinner, in the car park outside, my mother approached me. Desmond was slightly ahead with our daughter in the carrier. My mother stopped beside me and did not quite look at me directly. She said, "I didn't know." I said, "I know you didn't." She said, "She never told me she was considering something like that." I said, "She didn't need to." My mother was quiet for a moment. She looked at the ground. And then she said something I had not heard from her in 34 years or possibly ever. She said, "I haven't been fair to you." Just that. Not elaborated. Not explained. Not immediately retracted or qualified. I said. I looked at her for a moment. I said, "No. You haven't." She nodded. We did not hug. We did not cry. It was not that kind of moment. It was the other kind, smaller and more real. Desmond was at the car. I said good night and walked toward him. He had the baby in the carrier, fast asleep against his chest. He looked at me when I reached him and said, "You okay?" I said, "Yes." He opened the car door. Got in. He buckled the carrier in the back and got in the driver's side and started the engine. And did not ask me any more questions until we were on the main road, and I had been quiet long enough that he knew I was processing and not avoiding. Then he said, "Did she say something?" I said, "She said she hadn't been fair to me." He was quiet. Then he said, "How did that feel?" I said, "Like the beginning of something. Maybe." He said, "That's enough for now." I said, "Yes. I think it is." The weeks after the birthday dinner moved quietly. My mother called once and did not bring up the cottage. She asked about the baby's latest developments, and I told her she had discovered that her own feet were attached to her body and found this endlessly interesting. My mother laughed. It was a real laugh, not a performed one. We talked for 12 minutes. It was the easiest phone call we had managed in recent memory. Vanessa texted me a photo of her son on a Thursday with a message. "He figured out how to pull himself up on the furniture today, and I thought of you immediately because he had that exact look you get when you've decided something." I wrote back, "That is the best compliment anyone has given me in recent memory." She sent 3 laughing faces. We were not close yet. But we were closer than we had been, and the direction of travel was correct, and I was going to tend to it accordingly. My grandmother's vascular dementia had been progressing in the slow, uneven way it does. There were days she was entirely herself, sharp and dry and precise. There were other days where she reached for a word and found a gap where it had been. One of the good days she told me she was glad she had done everything she had done when she did it, and that timing was most of wisdom. I wrote that down in the small notebook I keep in the kitchen drawer. On one of the harder days she called me by my mother's name twice in the same conversation and then laughed at herself and said, "I know who you are. I just sent the wrong word." I said, "I know, Grandma." She said, "You have her jawline but everything else is entirely your own." I said, "I'll take that." She said, "You should." There were 4 Sundays in March and each one my parents arrived at 2 and stayed for the agreed time and honored the terms I had set. My father complimented Desmond's work on the back deck once, directly and specifically, and Desmond received it with a nod and said he had plans for the side fence too, and my father asked a genuine question about the timber and they talked about it for 6 minutes. My mother brought our daughter a soft toy she had chosen herself, a small knitted deer, and said she thought she would like the texture. She was right. The baby held onto that deer for the entire visit and fell asleep with it in her fist. These were small things. But I had stopped measuring small things against the scale of large wrongs. I was measuring them against the only question that actually mattered now, which was whether the direction was right. That was enough to work with. In April, I drove to my grandmother's house on a Saturday morning with lentil soup, and the kind of unhurried morning that asks nothing of either of us. She was in the garden when I arrived. The tomatoes were coming up. She handed me a trowel, and we worked side by side for an hour without needing to fill the silence with anything. Then we went inside and ate at the round kitchen table, and she asked about the cottage, and I told her about the porch stairs and the steel-colored lake and the bird in the birch tree. She nodded slowly. She said, "Your grandfather once sat on that porch for an entire Sunday afternoon watching the water, and said he had never felt less behind schedule in his whole life." I said, "I understand what he meant." She said, "I thought you would." We sat for a while. After that, with the radio on low and the garden outside the window and the soup finished and the coffee going cold because we kept forgetting to drink it. And I thought about the fact that this woman had carried a secret for 18 months and kept it carefully and delivered it at precisely the right moment with the precision of someone who understood that timing is most of wisdom. I thought about all the things she had watched without speaking. All the dinners. All the silences. All the time she had looked at me from across a room with that steady expression that said, "I see you and you will be all right." She had not rescued me from anything. That had never been the point. She had simply held a record and waited until what she had built could go somewhere that honored it. I reached across the table and put my hand over hers. She looked at it and then looked at me. She said, "You turned out exactly as I hoped." I said, "You had more to do with that than you know." She said, "I know exactly how much I had to do with it." And she smiled the smile that has been the most reliable thing in my life for 34 years. The lake cottage. We went back in April. Desmond replaced the porch stairs over a single weekend, working in the early mornings before the baby woke from her first nap. He sanded the old chairs while I sat in one of them with our daughter in my lap, and a coffee going warm in my hand, and the lake doing what lakes do in April, bright and restless and entirely itself. We have not decided everything about what to do with it long term. We have talked about summers there. Desmond has talked about certain structural improvements he could do in stages. I have talked about teaching our daughter to swim in that water when she is old enough. Neither of us has said anything about selling it. I do not think either of us will. There is something about a place that has been held for 50 years by people who loved each other well that you do not simply convert into an asset. My grandmother asked me once whether I had decided what to name the cottage. I said we hadn't thought about naming it. She said every place worth keeping deserves a name. I thought about it for a few days and then I called her back and said, "Ruth's." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That is far too obvious." I said, "I know. That's why it's right." She said, "Fine. But only if she inherits the name along with the deed eventually." I said, "She will." She said, "Then we are agreed." We were agreed. I want to be honest with you about something. I did not come through this story as a person who won something. I came through it as a person who finally stopped measuring myself by the score my parents had decided to keep. The cottage is not a trophy. It is a place. My grandmother's transfer of it to me was not a punishment to my parents. It was simply an honest expression of what she actually valued. The change in my family has been partial and uneven and real. My mother still occasionally reveals the shape of old habits in small moments. A comment about Clifton's new contract, a lingering interest in Vanessa's calendar that she thinks goes unnoticed. My father is doing the slower work of a man who has realized late that some of his silences cost him something, and is now trying to be present in ways that don't feel entirely natural to him yet. I receive these imperfect efforts as what they are. I do not inflate them and I do not dismiss them. Vanessa sends me a message most weeks. Sometimes just a photo. Sometimes a real question. Last week she asked me how I stayed patient when things felt impossible, and I thought about it for a day before I wrote back. I said, I stopped waiting for things to be different and started working with what was actually there. She replied, "I think I needed to hear that." I said, "I think you already knew it." He said, "Maybe. Probably." My grandmother spends time with us regularly. She is at her best in the mornings and in the garden. There are days now where she forgets certain things, reaches for words that have moved, looks at something familiar as if from a slight distance. But she has never once, in any of those moments, forgotten who our daughter is. She holds her with the same calm certainty she brings to everything. And she still hums that melody sometimes, low and unhurried, the one that has lived in the women of this family for 4 generations without being written down. Our daughter turns her face toward it every single time, as if she already knows it, as if she has always known it. It is a Tuesday morning and I am sitting on the porch of Ruth's. The lake is doing what it always does, arriving, receding, arriving again. Our daughter is asleep inside in the travel crib Elaine sent in a box so large Desmond had to turn it sideways to fit through the door. Desmond is on the side of the cottage replacing 2 boards on the exterior wall that had weathered softer than he was comfortable with. I can hear him working. The regular sound of it. The complete reliability of it. On the kitchen table inside, my grandfather's round table that has been here since 1978, there is a frame I put up last week. My grandmother holding our daughter on the day they met at the hospital. Both of them looking at the camera with that particular ease of 2 people who have recognized something in each other that they cannot name and do not need to. For generations in a frame on a table in a cottage by a lake that was held with care for 50 years and is now mine. I do not know with certainty what the next years will look like with my parents. I do not know if my mother will ever fully understand what she spent decades building and what those decades cost her. I do not know if my father will find the words he is still looking for. What I know is that the terms are in place and I have honored them, and so far they have too, and that is a foundation, even if it is a modest one, and modest foundations can hold things if you build carefully on top of them. My grandmother told me once that her mother used to say that love that does not announce itself is often the love that lasts. I did not entirely understand that when I was young. I understand it now. I understand it when I think about Ruth sitting in the corner of every room for 30 years, watching and recording and waiting. I understand it when I think about Desmond in that parking lot outside my parents' house, engine off, holding my hands, not saying a word because he knew the silence was the honest thing. I understand it when I look at the framed photo on the old round table and see my grandmother and my daughter looking at each other across a whole century of the same quiet choosing. If you are watching this and you are the one in your family who keeps showing up without ever being called to the front of the room, I want to say something to you directly. Someone is watching. Someone has been watching for a long time. They may not have said anything yet. They may be at their writing desk right now with the lamp on late. They may be waiting for the right moment, which is different from never acting. Some things take time not because they are unimportant but because they are being done right. Hold on. Keep showing up. Keep building the life that is actually yours. If this story reached somewhere real in you, please leave me a comment. I want to know whether you would have kept the cottage entirely private or whether you would have told your parents sooner. There is no wrong answer. Just yours. Hit like if you believe that quiet, patient love is a form of power. Subscribe to Auntie's Stories if you want more like this one. And check the description because I have linked a few others I think will find you at exactly the right time. I'll see you in the next one. Mean that. Thank you for staying until the very end. Take good care of yourselves and take good care of the people in your lives who have been taking care of you all along, the ones in the corners of rooms, the ones with the lamps on late, the ones who show up without being asked and stay without needing to be thanked. You know who they are. Go tell them. I'll see you soon.